Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Conscious Grief Series 5. And today I am joined by Mandy Murphy, who is a professional coach specializing in grief and mindfulness, as well as resiliency and vulnerability training based on Brené Brown's work, which is fascinating. So welcome, Mandy.
Thank you. Good to be here with you.
Yeah, so good to be here with you as well, Mandy, because you were going to be on the last series and then another big grief hit you.
Yes.
Yeah, actually, maybe we should start there.
Okay.
Because when we first spoke, we talked about your bereavement as a widow, and then you lost your father. And one of the things that's, now become very apparent to you is that all losses are very different, and the way, grief represents itself is also different. So perhaps you'd like to speak about that experience for yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I've learned a lot in the last year since Dad passed away. And I think we were scheduled to do our series interview within a week of Dad's passing. And so I appreciate the spaciousness to just be in my own grief. And yet here we are almost a year later. And I've learned an incredible amount about the different circumstances and the impact that has on my journey with grief. So my dad, I'll start with my dad. My dad was 82 and had a series of illnesses that he was navigating fairly strongly until about 3 months before his passing. And then it was kind of a quick decline and, a lot of navigating, being in the hospital, out of the hospital, home care, supporting my mom. So there was a lot leading up. And obviously, I think a lot of grieving before his death, just watching kind of his quality of life deteriorate so quickly. And yet he was 82. And when he actually did, get to the point of recognizing and acceptance that we were going to stop, we were moving into just comfort care. There was a piece about that process and such a gift of about 48 hours of just watching my dad accept his death right in front of him, watching all of my family, supporting my children through that process, watching what my heart was doing. And so even though it was incredibly difficult and never prepared, there was a piece about it that he knew he had lived a full life. He had some kind of fun jokes he made, right? And, while he was still able to speak some in the last 24 hours, and just gratitude for his full life and an acknowledgement of what was important to him and how he lived a life according to that. So it was really a special gift. And that quite is in contrast to the death of my first husband, which is 22 years ago. So obviously that one was very different because my first husband was 30 when he died. He went out on a run like he did almost every day and had just a random heart incident and died immediately. And I was in the vicinity, I was in the area and was able to get to him while the paramedics were working on him, trying to revive him. But I also was 8 months pregnant at the time with our first child. So just there are the obvious kind of differences in the loss of Will was my first husband's name, the loss of Will and the loss of my dad. And the grieving process has reflected how different those are. It took me about 3 years or so to really, I think, process the trauma around my husband's death. And there isn't really that same sense of trauma or disordered. It felt more natural with my dad being of the age that he was. So there's just many things that I could probably go on and on about, like how I've noticed how different the grieving process is given the circumstances and given my relationship with each of these two lovely people. So,
Yeah, well, it's so traumatic what you had to go through with Will. And as you say, there's a lot of trauma in that grief, which is the difference by the sounds of it from what happened with your father. Even though we kind of are more prepared, and I think death is always a shock, even if it's expected. But obviously, in the case of your husband being young and then also being pregnant as well, and the impact, on you becoming a new mother for the first time, and an early widow, a young widow. I mean, it's a huge thing.
Yes, and it's interesting. I still, it's just taken me a long time to kind of own that was a trauma. I think this is very common and typical, but it has taken me a while to kind of own that was such a trauma. I think, when I was navigating that, I had to do it. Like I had to just get through it. I had to be there for my daughter. I had to give birth. I had to, so I think it just took me a long time to really be able to see, and kind of be willing to give what I went through, kind of the magnitude of it. It just kind of took me a while to get there. Eventually I did. And my body did too. My body took quite a hit in terms of just unprocessed grief, but eventually I was able to kind of really see the layers of complexity that I was navigating. And, I'll never forget when I went into labor, which actually everybody thought I was going to like very quickly go into labor. I think everybody was really expecting for that to kind of trigger labor, and it didn't. And in fact, I went past my due date. So he died. Eventually, it was about 5 weeks from when he passed away to when I went into labor. And I remember checking in at the hospital, and when you fill out the form, there was the box of married, single, widowed, it was the first time that I had kind of the identity reality check. And selecting that widowed box, I just thought, I'll check the box because that's technically what I am, but I certainly don't feel like that. So I had many, many years of kind of sorting through the identity changes that come when you lose someone that you love. And then to so quickly also assume the identity of a single mom. That's not at all how I viewed anything. So it took me obviously quite a while to kind of absorb that and find comfort in that.
Yeah. And these are such, people who are listening will really, identify with this sort of new identity of ticking boxes. Like that can be an extremely, triggering moment. Things like that.
Yeah. And to have so much fuzziness. I mean, my memory, I really struggle with my memory during, not even just right after his death. There's just these kind of swaths of time in the years that went after. So I can have a very fuzzy memory, but then I can almost physically see where that box was on that form, which I find so, kind of indicative of how powerful of an experience that was. Like I can almost see like, oh, it was on the top third of the form, and there was just a line of them, and it was the far right one. And I just think the fact that I can have such a fuzzy memory from so much of that time, but I can remember the details of that. Is just kind of an indicator of how powerful that was.
Yeah, truly, truly powerful. And you said your body started to really take the hit from
Yeah.
experience. So how did that manifest, and how sort of long after did you start realizing that you were struggling physically?
Yeah. Again, it wasn't, I mean, in hindsight, it's a little bit easier to say, okay, well, yeah, I noticed after about 3 years. I mean, there was just a variety of physiological things, a little bit of heart stuff. I had, just some kind of chronic respiratory stuff that went on, some pretty significant weight changes, and it didn't really matter. I mean, I did I did hold on to, like, running was one thing that I had. Running and meditation were two kind of things that I had really from my college years. And so that just was such a healing space for me. So I did keep that up, but I had, quite a bit of weight loss. And just, it's hard to kind of tease apart how much of it was being a single mom versus grief and all of that. But, sleep disturbances. And then it was about at 3 years in that I just recognized, like, energetically, emotionally, I was just completely depleted. I mean, there was just no juice in there for any form of kind of living in a way that aligned with what was most important to me. And so I really had to kind of go through a rebuilding process. And then many years after that, this was about at like 7 or 8 years after my husband passed, I started to have a lot of GI issues. And I don't know how much of that is directly correlated or not. I have kind of a spiritual belief that, the body does keep score, and that, there was just a lot of unprocessed stuff in my gut. And so I started to have quite a bit of GI stuff that I had to kind of navigate. And, some of it turned into, real diagnoses or whatever that I learned to kind of recover from. But some of it, I just wonder if it was unprocessed grief.
Yeah, I imagine very much so it was related to that.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that you had always had a meditation practice.
Yes.
And that you like to.
Thank goodness.
You were ahead of the game with that. And what about so you're thinking about things like meditation, awareness, and how that can help the grieving process?
Well, yes, I kind of smiled when I said thank goodness. And I do feel like there were so many things in place for me to survive what I went through. And I would say my meditation practice was one of those, just because I think I can't totally speak to this because I don't have the opposite experience. I've never been in a situation where I haven't had a meditation practice, but I have worked with a lot of people who don't have any kind of formal awareness building practice or presence practice. So I do have some visibility into what it could be like through other people's experience, but I just feel like it allowed me to have a relationship with my grief that equipped me to have agency over the process a little bit. I mean, that's not to say that I had any kind of control over it. I don't mean that at all, but how I showed up with it, how I showed up with those waves or those tornadoes or whatever version of it was. I think because of my meditation practice, I I had some tools and was equipped to show up with it in a way that felt good for me, and felt like I still had some agency and I had a kind of the power of choice in how I was going to respond to, the emotions of grief, the comments of others, the comments from internal, the storylines that just I would find, on autoplay. It kind of equipped me to navigate some of that in a way that I personally feel good about.
Yeah, it's really amazing to hear that you had that self-awareness, you had the meditation practice. And I'm curious, at that time, were you reading anyone's work in particular, like teachers of meditation,
Yeah.
or even,
Yeah. So somewhere fairly early in my grief counseling work, I was turned on to the work of Tara Brach, and I went to several meditation retreats and silent retreats with her over the course of many years. So she was highly influential in my grieving journey, and in my kind of skilling myself up to be able to practice self-compassion and awareness, and the importance of self-compassion and awareness working together. So she was highly influential. I also went to training and was a big follower of John Kabat-Zinn and his work in mindfulness-based stress reduction. So went to training to be able to offer that to others. And but of course, as with any kind of situation like that, I probably benefited way more than I will ever be able to offer other people. But just really loved how accessible he was able to make some of the meditation practices that I think sometimes are associated more with certain religions. He was able to kind of make it more mainstream. So I appreciated that. Yeah, so I'd say those two were kind of the biggest influencers in kind of the meditation space. And someone gifted me with the book, When Things Fall Apart by Pema Chodron, very early on. And I have to say, it was one of those gifts that when someone handed me this, are you familiar with this book?
Yes.
Do you know? Yeah, okay. So when they handed me the book, my immediate reaction, I think, is very telling of where I was in my journey. But I just looked at it and I thought, well, this is a little bit disrespectful to give me this. My life is not falling apart. Like, I just based on the title, I hadn't read anything in the book, just based on the title, I was so committed to nothing falling apart and to holding it all together. I had a new baby, and I had incredible family support, and I had all the things that was not going to let this thing fall apart. So it was a little bit like of an interesting initial step in my relationship with Pima's work. But then I read the book eventually about 8 months later, and that was incredibly powerful to just kind of grapple with these concepts of groundlessness and abandoning hope, and the things that I think at the time I just had to hold so steadfast to this concept of holding it all together. And in due time, I was eventually ready to kind of loosen the reins on that and really lean into some of Pima's work. And she was highly influential as well.
Oh, I love that you're speaking about all these teachers, and that you've had the privilege of, being in the presence of
Yeah.
Brack and John Kabat-Zinn. It's amazing.
Yeah. Yes.
And obviously,
very powerful.
Now we're at a time where, there's a lot of trainings in grief, but this has been much more of a recent phenomena, really. And, you were using these tools of being present, really being conscious in your experience. But it is very interesting how you had that resistance, and you're like, I've got it all together, I'm fine, I have a good family, and how you said it took you a long time to really sort of see what happened as a trauma.
Yeah.
And I think that's very common too. I mean, even for myself, with my dad dying when I was 9, I never saw that as trauma. I never saw that as trauma. And again, I always was presenting like, as we all were in our family, we're fine, worse things happen to other people, not going to feel sorry for ourselves, we have many things to be grateful for, many blessings. And in a way, it sort of, stops you from really feeling.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that sometimes, being in the state of like the victim, like, oh, this shouldn't have happened to me. It's not fair. Why is this happen to me? There's a lot of need to be in that place.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're speaking to something that there was a little bit of a turning point. Well, no, I'd say more than a little bit. There was a pretty significant shift that I experienced actually in the space and wisdom of grief counselors working with. I grew up with, a household and a mom who really is like one of the most spunky, bright spirited humans that I know. She has just this amazing zest for life. She's incredibly positive. And, kind of when life gives you lemons, you make lemonade. And that's how we grew up, and or when something gets you down, pull up the bootstraps and soldier on. And she had to live that way. She had some early loss of both of her parents and every reason to kind of grasp onto that kind of mentality. And she's made a beautiful, like bright hearted life for herself. And I think I was trying desperately to kind of model that. And it took someone kind of giving me permission to, it's okay to model that. It's okay to believe that that's how we operate. And it's also okay to give yourself permission to say, this is terrible. Like, I did not sign up for this. This is not my plan. And just to kind of lean into the real underbelly of what I was experiencing and not trying to kind of spiritually bypass what I was experiencing. And that was a very important step in my healing journey.
Yeah. And I think it's different generations as well, isn't it? Like how it's almost, I feel like each generation becomes more conscious or more sensitive. We're much more open to feel the feelings now. Whereas, I think about our grandparents, who lived through a war and that was the way they survived, to talk about it. And so we're all, every generation is experiencing things differently. And some of us are having to, deal with grief that previous generations didn't process.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm watching that, my daughter that is Will, and my biological daughter who I was pregnant with, I'm watching her go through her own grief journey. She's 22 now. And I'm watching, I've seen layers of it, but, I'm watching her navigate her own grief as it relates to not having her biological dad and the protection of me. And, she too is aware of my mom's loss of her parents when one was at childbirth or her mom died at childbirth. And so I'm watching that generationally kind of carry on with her grieving journey as well. And it's a lot. It's hard work.
Yeah, it is hard work. And it's very interesting how some families, there is just a lot of death throughout the generations, early death.
Yeah. Maybe we qualify for that. I know what you mean. I don't feel like our family is quite that, but it does seem like there are people who just have to navigate early death, too often than feels right.
Yeah, I know. It's strange how it does manifest in certain families.
Mhm.
Um, so when you working with your clients, for example, what
Mhm.
do you feel of some of the modalities, if you like, or the things that you like to impart on them about how to walk with their grief?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, I think one thing that immediately kind of surfaced when you asked the question is this sometimes slow evolution or shifting of the mindset to have them know and trust, which are two different things, that they are equipped with everything that they need to get through this. I think that's one of the themes of work that I see fairly regularly is people often come, with this kind of external resourcing. Not that there's not value in external resources, and I think it's really helpful to have language and to hear common experiences. I think all of that is very helpful and supportive. And what I often feel is that with the loss, there was also this kind of chipping away of someone's belief in self, or maybe they didn't have it before, but it's just kind of this eroding of confidence and eroding in trust of self. And so a lot of some of the initial work is starting to kind of get them to kind of feel into what they already are equipped with to navigate this, and start to see from a different light and different perspective that they do have the wisdom, they do have the knowledge, they do know themselves. It's either buried over or it's been lost or it's been chipped away, but they have it. We just have to tap into it. So I think that's one thing. I would say another theme that I often see is I said knowledge and knowing they have it and building the trust. I think something happens with grief. It's like I just see it so common that it's almost like indecisiveness, and we lose, like, we don't know, we don't feel like we trust ourselves to be able to make a decision or to take a step or to take action. So a lot of work on not big long term, not looking so down the line, like really baby step things that help people rebuild their sense of like, okay, I said I was going to do this and I do it. And then that does build a little drop of trust in the trust bucket, and so just slowly rebuilding their trust with themselves. That seems to be some of the work. And then I would say the other is very awareness and kind of self-awareness based, is starting to create some space between their story about grief or their emotional experience of grief, and creating enough space where they have a choice in how they respond to it. And so that's a lot of just kind of mindfulness practices around, very safely. I mean, the situation, obviously, if there's, some kind of trauma involved or any kind of violence involved, it's a different process. But just really slowly getting them to get comfortable with feeling into these waves of grief, or really starting to see the story that they've been telling themselves about their grief or their loss, and starting to kind of tune into it in a really kind of turning down the external noise, turning up the volume on what's happening inside in such a way that they can learn they don't have to be afraid of it and they're not defined. You can feel incredibly lonely, but that does not mean you are a lonely person. And it's really important to build on the distinction between feelings and feeling these emotions and the stories that then come from these emotions, and having enough distance that these don't define you and therefore immediately trigger some kind of reaction. So a lot of space work in there, trying to recognize power of choice. What are your choices? What is a healthy choice and how you respond to this? And eventually that can build on that work. They can build on to slowly rebuild into like, what is important to me? What is meaningful? How do I honor this person? How do I integrate this loss in such a way that allows me to, miss them and honor them, and miss them and honor the gift of my own life to continue on. And so it's a slow but rebuilding process that I think happens with some of the awareness seeds that we start to work on.
Well, everything you're sharing, just sounds like very important tools, for everybody. And I love that. Like my the first part you were sharing, that we all have the answers inside of us. And I always remember my very first therapist saying that to me, and I'd never heard it before.
Yeah. Yeah.
Powerful.
And when you have so much noise from either the external world or from the loss itself, it's really hard to know that and to believe it in such a way that it empowers you. But it is there. I've seen it time and time again when we slowly start to tap in. It can be a body scan, it can be, a variety of different modalities. But once we slowly start to tap in, they start to recognize, like, actually, I did have that answer. I just didn't know it was there.
Yeah. And it is empowering.
Mm-hmm.
It is empowering, and as you were saying, then getting to a place, not immediately, that you have a choice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I think the other huge theme that I don't know if it's just kind of current, but it's been there for a couple years now. So it doesn't feel like one of those themes that kind of comes and goes. It feels like it's one that's kind of sticking, is the concept of duality. And, I mean, I think probably with Pema being one of the first to introduce me to this, but I'm starting to see it so incredibly strongly in people's integration of their loss, where there's so much but we want to make everything both or. And when you're grieving, sometimes things feel so big that you want to flip over and be on the other side of it. So you create this or. And I'm a big advocate for, like, there's space for both. I mean, I know it comes from an abundance mentality versus a scarcity mentality, but there is space for both. I can miss my dad and have tears and have all the sad emotions, and I can also have a very fond, tender-hearted memory all at the same time. Or I can be angry that such and such circumstance happened around, his healthcare process. And I can also have a lot of tenderness for his experience with this one particular doctor, or, so there's a lot of or that I think, no, I'm sorry, there's a lot of and that I think we often want it to be like ors, because we're so conditioned for things to be one way or the other for them to kind of make sense. And I try to kind of create more space for there to be a lot more and a lot more can swim in your swimming pool than you think it can.
Yeah, no, I absolutely love that. I think you're right. It's sort of like, I don't know why we're always so one way or the other, but like you say, I think I'm hearing it a lot more as well. This, like, we live in this existence of duality as a human being. If we're really coming from life with this more understanding that we are spiritual beings having a human experience, then we can hold the wrong, that it's not all a wrong or a right, it just is. And well, this shouldn't have happened to me, or, well, that's what we're dealing with. And like you talk about resiliency, and it's like, why me? But then why not me? Because terrible things happen. That is part of our human existence.
Yeah.
And we don't know why. We don't know why. But
Yeah. Yeah, I speak about that often, that another kind of big shift happened when I recognized how much I was asking why. And it was like kind of crystal clear. Like at some point I realized it was just a distraction from acceptance. If I can stay in the why and continue to ask myself why, then I don't really have to do the work of accepting this is what happened. This is part of being human. And I can spend the rest of my life trying to figure out why. I can research the particular heart diagnosis. I can do all of that. But ultimately, loss is part, death is part of the human experience, and loss is part of the human experience. And I do sometimes find myself dropping into the whys, and why doesn't my daughter have her biological dad? Why doesn't, I do go there, but I also have realized that isn't very serving for me, and often it's just a distraction from leaning into what I'm really experiencing. It's a very heady, very kind of keeps me up here instead of keeps me in the experience of grief.
Yeah, beautifully explained. Mandy, I always like to ask people in these interviews, how you would define conscious grief.
Yeah. Well, that's hard to do very succinctly, but I'll give it a go. I think consciously grieving is a willingness to be with and participate with the transformative power of grief. Grief changes us. Loss, losing somebody changes us. We never go back to who we are, even though we desperately sometimes try to get there and to do that. And so for me, conscious grief, I would say, is about a willingness to be without trying to make it something that is more comfortable or something that fits into your mold of it. It's a true surrender into the power of grief and into this very human of human experiences. In a way that also honors the gift of life. I mean, there's the and again, we do have, life is fragile and we are living. And so part of consciously grieving to me includes honoring the gift of life.
That is beautiful. Yeah. Sorry, you wanted to add something.
Well, I think we have a common bond also around Dr. Alan Wallfeld's work, and he companioning the bereaved was when I transitioned from, I was in nonprofit leadership for many years, and about 3 years ago, so I transitioned to just focus on grief support and education. And I read his book, and the way he talks about companioning our grief and being with and being in the stillness of it, being in this willingness to go in the silence of it. I kind of do an exercise sometimes of sitting at the park bench with it. And maybe my park bench needs to be really, really long so that it sits way on the other side. But sometimes that park bench, when I get stronger and more kind of in tune with myself, sometimes I can sit side by side with it and almost turn to befriend it, so it's not something that is like I'm battling with. It's more of I bring it into the folds of my experience, and it's uncomfortable, but I'm not as afraid of it. That to me is kind of companioning our bereaved, companioning our grief and being with others who are in that process. that to me is a way of being conscious with our grief.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I love that. And yeah, thank you for sharing, saying Dr. Alan Wolfelt's name. For people that don't know his work, we both highly, highly recommend. And he has a Center for Loss in Colorado and tons of programs. He's written so many books. His emails are wonderful. So yeah, good to talk about him. And your free gift?
Oh, yes, my free gift. I would just love the opportunity to support anybody who needs it or who feels drawn to kind of how I work and my messaging. The first 5 people who fill out the form, I'm happy to gift you with a free session.
That's so kind of you, Mandy. So we will have a link. Please do sign up, and Mandy can keep in touch with you. And as she said, she'll take the first 5, so do it fast.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Mandy, it's been so good to see you. I'm so glad we got to do this. The year went crazy fast, as life does. And thank you for the wonderful work you're doing and the beautiful presence that you are. So thank you.
You too. Thank you. Thank you for creating this space for everyday people to kind of share their journeys and, kind of start to build awareness where this is such a quiet part of life. So I just really appreciate a quiet external, really loud internal part of life. So I appreciate the work you do to create space for people to learn more about it and to get the support that they need.
Thank you.
And all right.
Everybody who's been listening and watching.
Bye. Take care. Thank you.